So I mentioned a moment ago the reactions against the Vedic tradition, and the primary one comes from Buddhism. By about 700 BCE, the priestly class had become so unpopular that people were looking for ways around this kind of strict, very rigid hierarchy, the system of obedience that kept people in their place. And so a group of people that we would call yogis, who practice a form of spiritual and physical discipline, became increasingly popular. We sort of know that today, in terms of the physical side of it, is called yoga, and comes from this Indian practice. Um, Asceticism is a kind of a denial, a disciplining, a training of both spiritual conduct as well as physical conduct. It's a lot about, much asceticism tends to be about denying one the ability to indulge in any sort of earthly pleasure. So not overeating, not being too lethargic, minding the way in which one conducts themselves with others, prayers, meditations, all these sorts of things would come under the ascetic banner. If we were to draw a comparison to Western civilization, this would be largely the monastic tradition, monks and nuns, people who really try to strictly train their senses and their conduct. They believed that through constant effort, the soul could be released from the cycle of reincarnation. That you did not have to go through reincarnation endlessly, and you could reach moksha, which was this sort of rest from that cycle of constantly being put into a new body. And another word that's sometimes used for it in both Hinduism and Buddhism is nirvana. Okay. The end game of both Hinduism, or the Vedic tradition, as well as Buddhism, is this moksha. It's just that within the Vedic tradition and system of religion, you have to go through all these cycles of reincarnation. While with Buddhism, it is possible, it's unlikely, but it's possible that if you were to thoroughly discipline your senses and your behavior, both physically and spiritually, you could actually be freed from reincarnation in one lifetime, and know moksha. The most important of the teachers that will emerge is Siddhartha Gautama, and we see his dates there, 563 to 483 BCE. He became known in India as the Buddha, which means enlightened one. So let's look at what the Buddha does. He came from an Indian princely family, but he gave this life up for a severe form of asceticism. He didn't find reward in the life, the ascetic lifestyle. So, and he practiced it for about 6 years, and really followed the teachings of the yogi masters. He found, however, that the kind of life that one ought to live could not necessarily be discovered by this severe discipline. And so he went for later on comes around to a more moderate form of lifestyle, in which you don't deny the body all of its needs. We'll see actually a good comparison in statuary between the sort of early life of the Buddha and the later life. But when he started to distance himself from the severe form of asceticism, he was sitting one day, as the tradition holds, under the Bodhi tree, and he had an epiphany, and that was that there are really 4 truths about life. He said, in life, people suffer. That suffering, comes from desire, and that the solution to suffering is to end desires. If we think about that, sort of the modern take on that might be we have to work. And sometimes work can be unpleasant. And yet, if we want a higher level of material wealth, if we want more things and nicer homes and nicer cars and so forth and so on, we have to do different kinds of work that may be longer, that might be harder, and so on and so forth. Okay, that might require more training, more college, more debt to get into those jobs, to have the lifestyle that we want. And what he says is that suffering can all be ended if we don't want all those things. And the way, therefore, that we end desire is to follow what he called the Eightfold Path. Some steps of which I have outlined below in the last bullet point here. The desire can be curbed if the follower, I should say, adopts a right view of things like conduct and what we say and how we live, in what kind of effort that we put into the things that we do, in fact, engage in. That we should be mindful of others and our relationship to them. Meditation is a big part of it, that we orient ourselves spiritually and correctly and so forth. So the Eightfold Path elaborates on all of those things, and that is the ultimate way to curb desire. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, here's the two sort of versions of Buddha, two of them. The one on the left is the ascetic, really denying the body of the things that it requires, and you can see it's a sort of emaciated Buddha, sitting in meditation and contemplation. This is the ascetic Theravada form of Buddhism. That would be a statue that would resonate with that particular branch of Buddhism. The one on the right is still not necessarily the traditional form of the Buddha that we see, sort of the plump-bellied man sitting under a tree or something like that. But it is much more that way of moderation that will resonate with the Mahayana version of Buddhism. And statuary, by the way, in Buddhism is quite popular. Statues of the Buddha are found everywhere throughout India, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and so forth. But you can actually see the image on the left is, practically a walking or reposed corpse in some way. And there are a lot of statuary in that tradition as well. And some more ghastly than that even. So again, I'll elaborate a little bit on those types of Buddhism. As he began to teach, he attracted followers, but when he died, he didn't leave any specific instructions of how to continue on the path. There was no real religious text that he said, but some of his followers wrote it down. However, some followers differed. They tended to emphasize one or other aspect of the Buddha's teachings. He told them just to follow one's own inner light, and so that really led to a multiplying effect of the types of Buddhism. Some followers of note who were regarded as having achieved enlightenment, instead of simply passing on to moksha and nirvana, actually returned and became teachers. These were called the bodhisattvas. Right? So they were kind of like the little Buddhas, if you will. They became the new spiritual leaders. And of those bodhisattvas, two major groups really started to emerge, as we saw in the statues, the Theravada and the Mahayana. The first group were more ascetic. They preferred the original teachings, the early teachings of the Buddha when he was still coming out of those 6 years of asceticism. And then there was the Mahayana form, which was what we might call more secular. So you'd live your life, you tend your home and your family, and if you were a merchant, you go out on the trade routes and so forth. And you would simply lead a normal lifestyle, but within a certain framework that was established by the Eightfold Path. So everything in moderation, I guess, is the way you could characterize it. As a result, the Mahayana form of Buddhism becomes much more popular because, in a way, it's much more doable. In a sense, the more ascetic version requires that, that you really become almost a Buddhist monk, that you follow this path very rigidly. And the form of Buddhism, however, that will tend to be more popular and will expand and spread into other parts of Central Asia and Tibet and Southeast Asia and Indonesia will be the Mahayana, or sometimes as it's called, the Great Vehicle version. And we can see actually here these two very large statues of the Buddha. They're carved into a mountainside, really. These were done in the Hindu Kush Mountains, modern-day Afghanistan. These colossal images, however, were destroyed when the Taliban came to power about 15 years ago in Afghanistan. So these, what were just, I don't think they were ever deemed a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, the organization that protects kind of antiquities and so forth. But they really were sort of these very, very unique. And you actually see almost, to extent, a kind of Greek influence on them in the way the drapery was done. So again, and that would have been from the time that Alexander the Great was out in this area as well. So there were amazing statuary that unfortunately some folks who are not tolerant of other religions did no longer saw fit to keep around.